So the second panel for the day is on the evolving jurisdiction of innovation ecosystems for India. In this, sadly, we have one panelist who could not make it, Aruna Sundararajan. But we do have two very, very exciting videos that we are going to play. One is on the testing Chinese exceptionalism in patenting behavior using corporate empirical analysis. This is by Professor J. Kesan, Professor of Law at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I think we have all heard the Chinese story of them overtaking patent filings even when compared to US. And the idea is, what is the real story? So let's hear from an academician. It's again a recorded session. This will be followed by Professor Haroff. He's the director of Max Institute for Innovation and Competition. And then we'll start with our panel discussion. So may I request you to play the audio clips, please?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jay Kesan. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry I cannot be here in person due to some scheduling conflicts, but I'm still pleased to be here. Come to Delhi very often. Today I'll focus on this question of whether Chinese patenting behavior is exceptional and is Chinese innovation exceptional, by looking at data comparatively from other East Asian countries and BRICS countries. My co-authors are Alan Marco, who's chief economist at the USPTO, and Rick Miller, who is also an economist at the USPTO. This work was done when I was a Thomas Edison Distinguished Scholar at the US Patent and Trademark Office. So, since the year 2000, we've noticed that there has been a substantial increase in the number of patent applications that have been filed in the United States from Chinese companies and Chinese inventors. And so what we're trying to do is to understand these patenting trends in the US for patent applications that originate from China. Why do we have this patenting increase? Is this some phenomenon that is unique to China? How about comparing it to similar trends in other East Asian countries like South Korea, Japan, or other BRICS countries? And what can we learn from comparing these trends from different decades? Obviously, the growth of China is the envy of the world. The Chinese GDP has more than tripled from the year 2000 to today. It's also been accompanied by a desire to have stronger patent protection, stronger IP protection in China. And the State Intellectual Property Office, the SIPO in China, has seen a dramatic increase in the number of patent applications that SIPO receives. For example, just in a little over a decade between 2000 and 2011, there was a 16-fold increase in the number of applications that have been received by SIPO. Now, China, of course, is often analyzed along with other BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. And these countries are seen as being the emerging economic powers. Yet, Chinese technology appears to be evolving at a much faster rate compared to these other developing economies. In addition, China also spends a lot of money on R&D. And according to the World Intellectual Property Organization, China applies for 3.5 patents for every $1 million that it spends on R&D. Now, Americans roughly apply for only one patent for every $1 million spent on R&D. That may mean that perhaps Chinese firms are more efficient in their R&D in terms of generating patents. Or it may also mean that they file a lot of patents and the patents are perhaps lower quality, or perhaps the incentives are to apply for a lot of patents, not necessarily to prosecute them and get them issued. Additionally, there is a lot of foreign direct investment in China, and perhaps these foreign companies are incentivizing and contributing to the increase in patenting in the United States from China. So there's certainly a lot of things that are happening out there. In addition, the government policies have been emphasizing IP, and there is, in fact, a strong national top-down emphasis on innovation, and with strong statements from Xi Jinping and others that innovation is in fact the heart of progress and economic development. In addition, the State Intellectual Property Office in China has been coming up with regulations that look very similar to the US Patent and Trademark Office. And so there's an attempt being made to reduce regulatory differences, to make it perhaps easier for inventors and other firms. So in order to study all this, what have we done? We've looked at USPTO patent filings from various countries and examined them over several decades, 80s, 90s, 2000s, etc. We've looked at the number of applications that have originated from China and other BRICS countries. We've also looked at applications originating from Japan, South Korea. We've looked at the allowance rates of these applications at the US Patent and Trademark Office. We've looked at the technologies that are covered by these patent applications. And we then compare Chinese patenting activity with these countries from different decades. And finally, we also looked at geographical distributions. So here's what we found. Let's begin by first looking at patent applications. And you'll see here the red curve shows the number of patent applications in the US from China. And you can see that from around 2005, there's been a rather sharp increase in the number of applications that are filed in the US. Comparatively, in the early 2000s, from other big BRICS countries, we saw the number of applications being roughly similar to China. But then, since the mid-2000s, China has sort of broken away, and the gap between the other BRICS countries and China seems to be increasing even more. So we now see well north of 10,000 applications every year from China. Now, what about the rate of growth? What about the rate of growth compared to a 2000 baseline? Once again, we see that the rate of growth of USPTO applications is also dramatically increased in China. And for the same period, the rate of growth for Japan and South Korea is shown below. And then you can see the rate of growth for other BRICS countries, which is really rather small. Keep in mind here that we're looking at the rate of growth. So the fact that the number of applications has not grown dramatically in the 2000s from Japan and South Korea is not surprising, because they started a very high number to begin with. But however, we see that the rate of growth from China compared to the other BRICS countries, which would be an apples-to-apples type comparison, let us look at something different, which is to look at that percentage change in the growth from 1997 to 2007 for China, and compare the same to South Korea from a decade prior, between 1986 and 1996. In other words, you see 10 years here on the x-axis, and I'm comparing the rate of growth of China to South Korea, and the green line is India. We see that, in fact, of course, the data is from different decades, but the growth in patent applications at the USPTO from China seems to be surprisingly similar to South Korea. In fact, the ramp up that you see is very similar to the kind of ramp up that South Korea had in the late 1980s, early 1990s. We see that the growth over a decade from India is basically steady, linear increase in the number of applications. What about allowance rates? Now, allowance rates is a good thing to look at because it shows how you're able to prosecute the applications and the sophistication with which you're able to do this. And the allowance rates here, what we find is that initially the allowance rates of China were similar to BRICS countries in the early 2000s, but towards the latter part of the 2000s, we started seeing the allowance rates from China approaching what you see from Japan and South Korea. In other words, we're starting to see more familiarity and a greater sophistication in getting the patent applications through. Okay, what about the technology mix? So what we find in the technology mix is, and this again is for the 6 different categories that I mentioned before, and this is the 6 categories from China. And you can see that computers, semiconductors, and transportation are the top 3 curves, are where most of the focus of the application from China is. It's primarily in computers and semiconductors. Notice that the blue line, biological, life science, chemical, and mechanical, are quite a bit lower. And we also see that this trend in terms of concentration in a few areas appears to be increasing. Now, comparing the changes in the technology mix with the BRICS countries, and Japan and South Korea, and all countries, we do see that from China, the bio areas, China files a similar number of applications in terms of percentages, to other BRICS countries. But other BRICS countries are more active in the chemical and in the computer area, which is the second curve. Relatively speaking, China is less active, but the Chinese applications are more active in the semiconductor and in the mechanical areas, particularly with the passenger. However, having said that, it is clear that if you look and compare across different decades, it does not appear to be the case that the growth in patent filings from China is all that exceptional. It seems to actually follow the trends from the late 1980s and early 1990s from South Korea. And it appears that the allowance rates from China are equilibrating to what you find from other developed countries as Chinese inventors are becoming more familiar. I would expect that the technology mix, while it's more concentrated now in computers and semiconductors from China, we might actually see more of filings in life sciences and biological areas so that it starts approaching what you see from a lesser concentration of what you see in Japan and South Korea. So in short, it looks like China wants to move up the value chain. China is very interested in filing for patent applications, and they seem to be more interested in doing so compared to other BRICS countries. But it still is in keeping with a pattern from other Far East Asian countries from prior decades.
Jay, Chirantan here.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This was a very instructive presentation. I just had one question. This is the India conference on innovation and IPR and competition. And you are talking here about temporal trends in China compared with Korea, one. Second, how different economies compare on within economy comparative advantages across sectors, so technology classes. And the last thing that caught my attention was agglomeration economies in China, for example, in Guangdong province. So if an Indian policymaker has to look at this and relate it to how it might enable economic growth, technology-based economic growth, what are the key lessons here from these findings on the Chinese patenting behavior for India to take forward going ahead?
I think one of the big takeaways is that China appears to be making a commitment to wanting to move up the value chain, go beyond labor cost advantages, and go beyond simply providing cheaper workers, and actually take the next step to try to generate more innovative products and to try to increase profits by coming up with innovative products and services. So in other words, it's not just focusing on manufacturing and production costs, but rather focusing on trying to get a comparative advantage through innovation. Now, Indians are amongst some of the smartest people on this planet, and so I think India should think about also moving beyond whatever advantages it might have in terms of low cost of labor.
So good afternoon, and again, welcome everyone for coming back. I missed some of you when I started the panel too. This was Professor Kesan from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His research focuses a lot on Chinese patent, and his talk was on testing Chinese exceptionalism in patenting behavior. And as you could see that, you know, China, we've all heard about the Chinese patenting trajectory and how they've been really filing a lot of patents. And I think the good thing is it's not an anomaly. A lot of other countries, South Korea and Japan, have followed similar trajectories in the past. And I think the conversation that we had in the morning about moving up the value chain and going from just a cost arbitrage to more of a talent arbitrage and moving up the higher of the value chain is what we are looking at. And I think maybe innovation is one good measure, or patent filing could be one good measure of a country moving in that direction. So with that, I'd like to now invite the panelists who are here for the second panel, which is titled The Evolving Jurisdiction for Innovation Ecosystem for India. And for that, we have two panelists. One is Hemal Shah. She serves as Director for India and Regional Markets at the US Chamber of Commerce Global Innovation Policy Center. She leads GIPC's advocacy efforts in strategic markets, including India, Brazil, and South Africa. Previously, she led the US Chamber, US-India Business Council's advocacy efforts in transportation and logistics, trade facilitation, supply chain infrastructure, and smart city policies. Welcome, Hemal. Please join us. I'd also like to take this opportunity and invite Dr. Amit Kapoor. He is President and CEO of India Council on Competitiveness and Honorary Chairman at Institute for Competitiveness, India. He's also the Editor-in-Chief of Thinkers magazine. He is an instructor with Harvard Business and the area of strategy, competitiveness, and business models. Welcome. And to moderate the session, I invite our faculty member, Professor Siddharth Singh. Siddharth is an Associate Professor of Marketing at ISB and Associate Dean of RCI Outreach and Engagement. He heads the Media Hub, which is ISB's initiative for excellence in media research. His research focuses on a firm's ability to achieve sustainable competitive advantage. He has co-authored 3 textbooks and published extensively in globally renowned academic journals. Thank you, Siddharth, for being here, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima. I know that I'm standing between you, this session between you and your lunch, so probably I would not be the most loved person in the room. But what we'll do is, like in the previous session, we'll have a short presentation by both the panelists, and then we'll open for question and answer and have an open discussion. Now, just to quickly summarize, we have had several speakers touch upon issues that are not unknown to us. For example, if you look at a lot of innovation coming out of India or anywhere, they leverage technological changes around us. That is one thing. And one would expect that the regulation should be in sync with these changes, which some of our speakers earlier touched upon is not the case. Whether it's privacy protection, intellectual property, or tax regimes, there is lack of clarity and stability in all these things. And the importance of this stability and clarity is well known. So with that, I hope that gives a sort of a flavor of why this session on jurisdiction is very important. And with that, I'll invite our first panelist, Hemal. So we had this sequence differently. So Hemal Shah, please welcome, and please take the podium and share your thoughts.
Thank you, ISB, for this opportunity. I'm just going to take a very few short minutes to talk about the US Chamber International IP Index and why India has been the most improved country this year, and the potential for a roadmap for its transition to a knowledge-based economy. So let me just move to the next slide. Yeah, purpose of an index, I mean, all of you know this. The index is really an empirical evidence-based tool to measure a country's IP environment against a set of predetermined standards. It has broad yet detailed coverage. We measure major forms of IPRs, so patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets. Major industry sectors are covered: ICT, life sciences, content, consumer goods. It also looks at legal situations and practical realities. So the basic construction here consists of 40 indicators. Each indicator is given equal weight. When we first started the index, it was in 2012 with 11 countries and 25 indicators. And now we have 50 economies, 40 indicators categorized under 8 categories. So here are the 8 categories and 40 indicators. The indicators really consist of, they measure basic protection of the right, the scope of eligibility, and the rule of law and enforcement. The indicators can also be binary or numerical or mixed. So it depends on each set of indicators and how we measure them. So what's new in 2018? The number of indicators have increased by 15%. So we had 35 last year, we have 40 this year. The new indicators include membership in a patent prosecution highway, national efforts at coordinating IP rights enforcement, awareness raising activities, and capacity building. It also has 2 new categories: commercialization, which is the talk of the town in India this year, and also systemic efficiency, which is really awareness raising and capacity building that I went through in the previous slide. We've also added 5 new countries: Costa Rica, Ireland, Netherlands, Morocco, and Jordan, just to cover the depth and the breadth of the index. So right now, it covers about 92% of the world's GDP. Here's a quick snapshot of what the overall scores look like. India is 44th, but it's also the most improved country of the index. Rapid progress in the last 12 months. The most improved country ranks first if we see this chart, which has been sort of regrouped based on the percentage change from last year. India's first, China's second, Thailand's third, and so on. So India had a 25% score last year. It's 30% this year. It's 12.03 out of 40. It reflects a strong performance in some of the old indicators as well as some of the new indicators, including the computer-implemented inventions and awareness-raising efforts. So I think it's important to note that when we talk about the index, it's really a roadmap rather than a report card, so to speak. In this case, India, we're not asking India to improve its score from the current 12.03 to 40. A 2-point difference, for example, can make a significant change. So incremental change is actually really important. In this year, India recorded a 3-point difference, which is a 20% jump from last year. And that's why it's ranked first over here. You can go to our website and look at the details of where India performs well and where there needs much work. Just to simplify things a little bit, 5 things that the index reveals about India. Top improver, we just went through that. Innovator on the move. So the first time in 6 years of the index, India has broken free of the bottom 10%. It's first among equals. In other words, it stands out amongst its peer economies, Brazil, South Africa, Russia, China, whose scores have either marginally improved or have slipped compared to 2017. Also building strong foundations, the scheme for IPR awareness from the national IPR policy, it's ahead of 21 other economies on this indicator. Finally, this time is different. We get questions about the old methodology versus the new methodology. I just want to quickly say, without getting into the details, that on the new indicators, India outperforms itself on its overall score by 20% compared to the old indicators and 58% amongst the new indicators. Even if you look at last year's methodology and control for the indicator that we've removed, and the 5 not have the 5 that we've added, India has significantly improved. Even the 5 new countries we've added are actually scoring above India anyway, so it's not the addition of the 5 countries that has bolstered India's ranking. What are others saying? We also found it interesting that other indices which reflect positive spillovers from its economic environment are actually shown in the index as well. For example, the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report mentions that for the first time, India moved into the top 100. It was the top 10 improver. Same with the IP index, similar story there. The Global Innovation Index talks about how it's an emerging nation in Asia. The WEF Competitiveness Index talks about how India stands out amongst the emerging markets. So, just from a developing country perspective, we find it hard to kind of convince people that IP is an investment and not a cost. So it's a critical first step to build the infrastructure needed to promote itself to a knowledge-based economy. So on the front end, this slide shows that foreign investment, IP investment in the front end attracts foreign investment, access to venture capital, foreign direct investment, which we already went through. On the output side, we have the growth of high-tech sectors, innovative and creative outputs, and so forth. This is the correlation that the index looks at. So on the input side, we found that countries with effective IP frameworks are 36% more likely to be supportive of an environment for R&D. On the output side, we found that 75% countries with strong IP systems are 75% going to be more knowledge-based, technological, creative outputs driven. So these are only 2 examples, but the economic benefits of IP investment are real. So coming to the end very quickly, transition roadmap for 2019. As I said, the index is meant to be more of a roadmap to sort of give a flavor, give an idea of a bird's eye view of the global IP system. For India especially, we feel like 3 important transitions would be key, and some of this was covered in the previous panels as well. India can harness its prowess from being a singularly services-led economy, which it does very well in, to sort of move into a more knowledge-based, innovation-driven economy. Secondly, incremental innovation. India can put legal and economic infrastructure in place to commercialize its established role in incremental innovation that was talked about in the last panel, actually. to more transformative high-end innovation. And no particular order, but last, facilitating innovation for itself rather than facilitating innovation for other countries, which it kind of does right now. With that, thank you so much for the opportunity to present on the index. And I'll say one thing, I did not make this index, but I am happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hemal. With that, I'll invite Amit Kapoor.
Hi, good afternoon, all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Chirantan, for getting me here to talk about some of my work. Just to make a very quick point, this is the work that I've actually done with, or a lot of work that I've done over a period of time with Mike Porter, and this one especially with the DIPP. So this is the work that we are doing for Ministry of Commerce, and we're just trying to understand as to how innovation really stacks up. I'll come up with the whole thing that when you talk about competitiveness, it's about productivity, how we actually end up using our resources. And when you talk about resources, it's like land, labor, and capital, the most important factor being labor. And so if you really talk about prosperity, prosperity is clearly about GDP per capita. And how does GDP per capita stack up, and how do we break it into understanding as to how it creates prosperity? Of course, there are issues of disparity within the country, but we have to go ahead and understand the labor utilization and labor productivity. And picking up the point from what Hemal was saying, that like when you talk about economies, like it's about two things, inherited prosperity and created prosperity. So what we are seeing within India, and very strongly I believe that India right now stacks up at the level of inherited prosperity, wherein we actually use our resources in the best possible way, and there is a labor arbitrage that actually happens. But from a created prosperity point of view, we have a long way to go. But then I think there are those antecedents, the infrastructure, the possibilities are absolutely huge. We have the right pillars or the right antecedents to go there. But before we go along, there's something very interesting that we see on labor productivity. These are some startling numbers which I thought I should share. Even the previous speaker before me, or the one before that on Skype, he actually shared some of the productivity numbers. But very interestingly, if you really talk about India in 2018, and China, the productivity difference is close to about 2 times. India is at about $4,000 odd, and then on labor productivity, China is at 8,000, world is at about 23,000. And if you really talk about European Union, it crosses about 65,000, and US is close to about 90. And we are going to see the trajectory that we are seeing, and the estimated numbers suggest that China and India would actually have a difference of 4 times in 2022. And why does that actually happen? So it actually happens because of geographical realities. It happens because of the clusters that we actually have, or how do we really focus on innovation. And then, of course, United States will cross 120K. So we are going to see huge difference in productivity within the countries that we are actually seeing. So that is where innovation becomes exceedingly important as we go along. In fact, just a very interesting set of numbers that I thought I'll share. If you talk about US productivity, these are the numbers from 2015. The productivity ranges from state to state. It ranges from $82,000 to about $150,000 across different sets of states. And when you talk about India, it just varies from $7,000 to $130,000. So if what you're seeing within India is a huge disparity in terms of performance within states, so you will actually have a state of Bihar where productivity is abysmally low, and you can actually look at the state of Maharashtra, Gujarat, Goa, wherein you will actually see huge levels of productivity. So why does it actually happen? Is it because the states are innovative or something of that sort? And then, of course, from an innovation perspective, if you talk about India, just looking at the Global Innovation Index, we have India, which is at fairly middle ground and things, and a lot of catching up across the world. There is this debate that actually happens within the country which say that should we even look at the global scenarios or not, which I believe we should, and the present government is also looking at those sets of imperatives. But what determines competitiveness? And why do I actually want to bring the whole lens of competitiveness? For a simple reason, competitiveness is driven by innovation that we actually have, either products, processes, and so on and so forth. And then clusters actually define a very strong imperative here. So the clusters, as you know, are geographical, proximate, interconnected companies, and so on and so forth. So what is the state of cluster development? And I'll come to that. But there is a huge link between innovation and competitiveness at a global level. And we can actually see this. So if you really look at countries, how India stacks up in both the countries which are doing well. So countries like Switzerland or Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, US and things, we can see that they are innovative and they're hugely what I call competitive as well. And when we actually see all these what I call indices, we find that India actually lags behind for a simple reason that there is an innovation capacity issue. But then we looked at this whole data from the set of Indian states as well. And you would find that it is true for India as well, that when you talk about states of India, states which are innovative would actually be more competitive as well. And when you talk about innovation, so if you talk about Tamil Nadu, you all know that the patenting behavior from these states are actually interesting. So the states of Maharashtra or Karnataka, Gujarat, they actually are innovative and they are more competitive as well. Quite interestingly, if you really talk about quality of life, we just did this index on quality of life for, with Niti, and this is where we find that quality of life actually has a huge bearing from innovation and competitiveness. So if you are more competitive, you will see that the quality of life actually improves. So the worst quality of life, if you are seeing in Bihar, is also accentuated by the fact that it is one of the most or the least competitive states. So we see this kind of a difference that actually happens. And why does this happen? It is about education at the end of the day. Places which have done exceedingly well on innovation, they actually have been what you call educational hubs, and they actually have huge levels of advanced education capabilities. So if you talk about places like Andhra or Karnataka or whatever, their antecedents were actually on education, and they actually saw a lot of innovative capacity that actually got built up, and these are the numbers that stack up. Innovation and access to information. A lot of people believe that is access to information important, but this is where we looked at something very interesting, and we found that access to information does multiply innovation at points in time because it reduces information asymmetry. We just did this very interesting piece on impact of telecom industry on GDP. And we found that in the last 1 year, everything remaining the same, with 160 million people who have actually got added to the telecom network, they can actually answer about close to 5.5% of India's GDP growth. So there is that whole huge thing that happens because of information access. And that means like information asymmetry has to get reduced. It has to be about knowledge. And then of course, innovation and employment. And within the states of India, we are seeing that states which are becoming innovative, they actually see huge or better trajectory of employment creation. And is there a link between innovation and wages? This is where things start becoming very, very interesting. When you talk about higher innovative capabilities, provide a region with a considerable competitive advantage. And then of course, patenting is a thing, and this is how patenting actually happens within Indian states. So what we are seeing is that states of Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Gujarat, Andhra, they actually do exceedingly well on patenting. They are also more competitive. But then, is there any kind of variation across on wages in states? So this is from the ASI data. We actually looked at data from 1998 until 2015 because that was the latest available data that we actually have from the annual survey of industry and NSSO. So what we find is that what we call the average wage of the highest earning state is about 10 times that of the poorest one. So that means that the disparity actually exists. So when you talk about Tripura versus Jharkhand, there is a huge disparity that actually happens. In fact, quite interestingly, Jharkhand is one of the states which actually sees the highest level of wages, quite surprisingly. But that's true for the manufacturing sector that we are seeing right now. And if you really look at industrial states like Tamil Nadu and Andhra, the average wages that fall below the national averages. We see that clearly. But what is the implication for it? In fact, I'll just read out. This implies that even those states are known for some high-paying sectors, most of the workers are employed in low-paying sectors. So why does this actually happen? So that means the innovative sectors are fairly small at this point in time. If you really look at Andhra per se, which has been touted as one of the innovative states and whatever, you'll find that food processing and manufacturing actually has the highest level of wages, not something else. So these are the differences that we actually see within the system. And as we were looking at clusters and we said, okay, what are the industries we have to look at? We looked at the same definition across the world. So the Economic Development Authority, EDA, in the US has this definition of clusters, and we actually said, okay, let's stack up this understanding of clusters, and if we are able to make things comparable across different parts of the world, we are able to understand as to how clusters are productive or how geographical locations are productive. This is what we actually looked at. And there was some very interesting insights that actually came through. There is no significant difference in the average wages or wage growth between traded and local clusters. That means there is a huge thing that we are seeing within India. that even people who are looking at working within India or whatever, they're actually looking at labor and low-cost labor. So we have to move towards innovative capabilities. We have to move towards innovative sectors if we really want to create prosperity. And when you talk about traded clusters, like they vary different substantially in terms of employment average wage. And this is what we found, that the average wages in high-tech clusters are higher by about 113,000, but then that's not a huge number. It's fairly small employment, something like IT sector, how much people get employed within the IT manufacturing or technology manufacturing. It's a fairly small number across the country. And employment does, or growth does not show a relationship with presence of high-tech clusters. So the whole obsession saying that high-tech will create jobs or whatever, we are not seeing that. So how do we actually look at these things? So there is something which is lacking and we have to look at. So we looked at this framework of understanding clusters and said, okay, specialization, size, productivity, and dynamism. And this is where we found that what are the states which are actually doing well on certain set of things. So if you really talk about apparels, Karnataka, Delhi, the Delhi region, Haryana, they are seemingly doing better on apparels and so on and so forth. So I can leave the presentation here. You can actually look at all the things that we have done here. But with states with highest employees across different set of sectors. So we can actually see that where are the sectors doing well and where employment is actually getting created. So any of the sectors that you want to see or clusters, you find this thing here. States with highest wages, and we actually looked at it. But quite interestingly, when you talk about Maharashtra, we found that Maharashtra actually takes the burden of growth. In fact, it contributes close to about 16 to 17% of India's GDP. And then, of course, within the Maharashtra thing itself, 6 locations answer close to about 80% of Maharashtra's GDP. So that means, and why does that actually happen? It is happening because of the innovative industries that they have actually been able to look at, the creative industries. So if you really look at the top 3 industries in Maharashtra, which are the creative industries, you see that that is where productivity is actually happening. And then, of course, we should not really say that creative industry is just about IT or whatever. There are many other creative ways of looking at it and then things. This is how Maharashtra stacks up on various sets of clusters. And this is how Maharashtra has moved over a period of time. So this is, again, data that we actually looked at over the last 18 years. But to make a point, I actually wanted to say that if you talk about biopharmaceuticals, there is a huge shift that is actually happening. This is one sector which is going to drive a lot of interesting things, and we are already seeing evidence of this. So what are the states which have actually done well and where cluster shares have actually moved on? So Maharashtra, Gujarat, Himachal, these are the states where we are actually seeing huge presence of clusters emerging. And where is it actually going down? Of course, West Bengal. There are many reasons for it. One of them being primarily a schizophrenic chief minister. But those are separate issues, so we'll not get into those realities, but each one of you know about it. So we have to actually take a bet on the leaders or whatever. So that this is where we are seeing a huge shift within the biopharmaceutical sector. And the average wages per worker are fairly interesting here. So if you really talk about wages in Goa for biopharmaceuticals, it's close to about 450K. So that means these are the sectors which are actually giving huge impetus to knowledge and knowledge creation and the high-tech sectors. But are there any kind of cluster strength and innovation? Are they interrelated? They actually are. States which have shown higher presence of clusters in industrial agglomerations, they're actually doing better. So that means we have to focus on understanding as to where industry agglomerations are, where the industry can actually go. And economic development and cluster strength, of course, there is a positive correlation between these two as well, and we are seeing those evidences. And competitiveness and cluster strength, again, there is a correlation that actually exists. So if you really look at cluster strength, so this is something what we found, that cluster strength is fairly weak in most of the regions in the country, except, say, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu. And they actually explain the burden of growth. In fact, there are about 6 states which actually take the burden of growth within the country. The rest of them are fairly slow, and so on and so forth. This is how India actually stacks up on exports on traded clusters. But the question here is, when we are actually talking about IP, and when we talk about innovation and things, why does it really get slowed down? We have to find, or we have to understand that it is actually about lack of trust. And that lack of trust is actually driven by a lot of times as to how we actually have our intellectual property laws. How do we actually respect intellectual property, and whether we are actually easily copying and so on and so forth. So what we find here is that there is a lack of trust between organizations, and we have to find very strong intellectual property laws to really drive it right. If we don't do it, we would actually start losing to China. There is this huge point of departure that we are seeing. China and India were actually at the same productivity level, very surprisingly, until the year 2000 on labor productivity. So that means it is just at that point when China started strengthening its IP system and that point of departure started happening. So it has to focus on IP. If we don't get it right, we will not be able to see huge advent of the innovation-driven systems. So of course, like when you talk about innovation, it just does not mean pharmaceuticals or computers. Every sector could be high-tech, because I fundamentally believe there is nothing like a high-tech industry or a low-tech industry. It is high-tech firms or low-tech firms. So you can actually do so much within agriculture itself, and you can actually draw patenting and so on and so forth. You can find solutions, and we have to strengthen it across the board. But then if you, something like, just to accentuate a point, what if a country lacks a robust IP regime? If it lacks a robust IP regime, then you would actually see huge level of distortions across the factor conditions or within the demand conditions itself. So the diamond actually starts getting skewed, and you are not really able to push the competitiveness of the country itself. But having said that, why does it really become important? Because clusters become important as a parameter for understanding, because it increases the productivity of constituent firms, because they're able to share knowledge, they're able to take it up. If you really talk about a point like Boston, New York area, it has close to about 60 of the smartest, pharmaceutical research firms and things. Why does it actually happen there? There is that industrial agglomeration across that system that actually happens, and we have to find ways of looking at it. It improves productivity and so on and so forth. So when you talk about clusters impacting competitiveness, absolutely. It is about the productivity within clusters gets enhanced, and the whole issue of innovation actually is going to be driven from there. And then, of course, the business formation. At the end of the day, when you talk about innovation, it's about business formation. A startling number again, that Hong Kong actually has higher business formation than whole of India. So that means we have to actually get it right. And how do we get it right? It is actually going to be about intellectual property. It is actually going to be about how easy is it to start and be very sure that my things are going to get protected, or whatever I do is actually going to get protected. Thank you. So these are a few points that I wanted to make. Thanks a lot, please.
Thank you. Amit. We can now take your questions. I can ask to start with Hemal. If let's say you have to pick up 2 or 3 specific areas that you feel where the government must pay attention to increase innovation or support this ecosystem in India. So which of those would be?
So from an IP point of view, it would be sort of broadening patentability criteria and eligibility, having regulatory data protection terms. So those are 2 big areas. India already is a TRIPS compliant country, and I think it doesn't matter if it signs on to more IP related treaties, which would not change anything, but just sort of institutionalize it. So I think those are the 3 sort of very specific IP related changes. But I think looking at the bigger picture on innovation and the roadmap that we see India sort of taking in the next few years, sort of what we think is that IP sort of helps creating jobs and economic growth. In the US, it's contributed to about 45 million jobs. So IP intensive industries create 45 million jobs, contribute to a lot in terms of economic growth and GDP. India's competitiveness in the years to come is going to lie in that, and sustained economic growth is going to lie in that. An innovation-driven economy is really the answer to maintaining geoeconomic and geopolitical competitiveness. So we feel like these are steps that India could take in order to get closer to that goal.
Okay. And Amit, you mentioned very clearly that IP protection is very critical. At the end of it, towards the end of the presentation, what other factors you think are that the government could do or we could do to improve this ecosystem?
So I think the most important point for really pushing the ecosystem is going to be the educational institutions, as to how technical institutions really look at improving their state of being. Quite interestingly, like we just have this task force at NITI wherein we are trying to understand as to how the performance of technical institutions is happening, and we find a fairly abysmal picture right now. And how do we really look at it? It's about patenting behavior, it's about many things that actually happen. Just to share a point, one of the IITs was given about 400 crore rupees 5 years back to actually do a research on water and solve the problem or water cleansing issues in India. They did not do anything with that money. So it's still lying after 5 years in exactly the same amount. So that means there is a severe issue in terms of like how we are really looking at research and pushing that research. So research becomes very critical. In fact, if you really talk about industries which have done well or have not done well in India, so if you talk about, say, something like a sports good industry in India, why did it not do well over a period of time? It did not do well because of severe lack of what I call knowledge creation around it. In fact, in the 1980s, when technology was moving up in this sector, like you were moving from what I call wood frames to steel frames or carbon frames or whatever for rackets, India just lost it. The educational industry was not really making a contribution. So we are seeing a whole huge lacuna there. So how do we strengthen the linkages between education and the industry itself? Today we see that there is a whole huge gap that actually exists between these two. Till the time we do not really set it right, I think we are going to have severe issues. And the second thing which I believe very strongly, we have to focus on our primary education, and that is where creativity is actually going to come through. If we don't really get that right, we are going to face a lot of problems. In fact, what Hemal was saying, that India has to be an innovation-driven economy, but then the question is the trajectory from what I call factor-driven to efficiency-driven to innovation-driven. It's not going to be that simple. Right now, even today, I believe that we are still stuck at that factor-driven system because you're talking about exploitation of labor. You're not really looking at strengthening those systems. So how do you strengthen that at the local level? You'll need institutions across the board to really set it right. And as long as and then second thing, which is, or the third thing which is exceedingly important is that how do I actually look at the bureaucratic hurdles or the regulatory problems that we actually face within the system? Today, I think the regulatory systems are far more curtailing for innovation than any other thing in the country. So I need to actually remove the bureaucratic hurdles or whatever. I think the whole bureaucracy in the country is actually patched up in a way. It is about control, not about enabling. There are processes which have happened in the last 5 years. We have to confess to that there are changes that are happening. But I think we have still a very long way to go, wherein we should not really think that industry is all corrupt. I find a lot of people within the government who think industry is corrupt, it's about exploitation. No, we have to understand that it is industry which is going to solve problems. It's not going to be anything else. Government just has a role of enabling the environment.
Okay. Do you have any questions from the audience? Yes, Professor. Just give us a second. We'll come back.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Keith Maskus from Colorado, United States. So, Professor Kapoor, Mr. Kapoor, very interesting data. Lots of quite interesting correlations. One thing we've discovered in looking at firm-level productivity and heterogeneity is there's a tremendous divergence going on between the most productive and largest companies, whether in the United States, Europe, or anywhere else, including China, and everyone else. So the productivity gains seem to be concentrated in a small number of highly innovative firms. And I'm wondering first if that is the case in India, if you've been able to look at firm-level data, and secondly, what you might do about that if that's a concern.
So, you know, I think the data says the same set of things in the US and in the Indian context, that the higher levels of productivity or growth in productivity is being seen at the top-end enterprises. And that actually happens because they understand innovation better and they're actually taking it forward and they're trying to actually either it's a product level or a process level. The question is going to be that how do we take it to the next level for smaller enterprises and things? Can I actually create that entrepreneurial ecosystem? I believe there is this whole huge step that has actually happened towards the entrepreneurial ecosystem in the past, but I think it is still very, very weak. We have to actually do away with the obsession of just seeking jobs or whatever. I think we have to create that obsession for creating enterprises, creating products and whatever. I think that there is also something very strong here, and that is that we have not made brands out of India. I think India severely lacks that brand thing, wherein we are able to look at those productivity measures. There is hardly any brand that I can talk about. Even the enterprises which are touted as the finest in the country are incidentally the worst. If you talk about enterprises like, I think the, enterprises like TCS or Wipros or Infosys, I think they're the worst to happen to the country anyways. For a simple reason that they are absolutely abysmally low on productivity. So what we have actually done is we have never looked at things beyond labor arbitrage. In fact, even these set of companies are actually on labor arbitrage. There's hardly any product that they're looking at. So I think it becomes exceedingly important that we actually look at creation of enterprises, innovative enterprises, and that will start from the university system, and I'm very convinced on that. If we don't strengthen our university system towards enterprise creation, it is not going to happen. So it actually lies with people like Rishi. In fact, I would actually also want to make a call that the first IIM that should actually ban placement should be IIM Indore. I'm sorry, Rishi, but then I'm just provoking you here. So if you really look at it, why have placements at all? Are we creating job seekers, or we want to create entrepreneurs? So that's a larger issue that we have to look at.
Okay. Yes, please.
Sir, I couldn't follow the clusters. Correlationship between clusters and innovations. What is actually cluster is, and how they help in innovation. So secondly, that we are listening and we are reading also that China and Korea and other countries, Japan, are ahead of Indian in patents, number of patents. There is utility model or petty patents, but India has not. What are the problems that India is not providing petty patents or utility models? Thank you.
So I think I can answer the first question better. Very simply put, if you really look at it, as I define a cluster, I'll use the international definition, I'll read it out for you. Cluster is a geographically proximate group of interconnected companies and associated institutions in a particular field linked by commodities and commonalities and complementarities. The geographic scope of cluster ranges from a region, a state, or even a single city or span a neighboring country. So that means these are different sets of institutions that actually come together. In fact, what we define as a cluster in India could be, oh, we have these set of agglomeration of firms and you call it as a cluster. No, it is not a cluster, it is an agglomeration of firms. A cluster would mean that you have different sets of industries which work together, which are able to share knowledge and create new things. And we see those evidences. We are seeing very strong evidences in Maharashtra and Gujarat of that. But we are not seeing those evidences in other sets of states because we've just got that whole cluster definition wrong. We've just got that whole idea of economic geography wrong in this country, driven by people like UNIDOs of the world and MSME foundations of the world, or even MSME ministry. So we've actually just got focused or fixated on those sets of ideas. We need to set it right. And how long we can actually look at stupid things from UNIDO. I'm so sorry for saying it. If anybody from UNIDO, I mean it, please, and it is to hurt you.
Yes, please.
Anirudh Shingal, I'm a research associate at the World Trade Institute, University of Bern. My question is for Professor Kapoor. One of the scatter plots that you showed was looking at the correlation between competitiveness and innovation for Indian states, and it seemed to suggest that the fitted trend line is actually downwards.
It was reversely plotted, so that is my mistake. In fact, I realized it today in the morning. I did not have time to change it. Okay. So that's where it is. So it was wrongly plotted.
Okay. Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah, hi, Nitin this side. Like, my question is for Amit. Like, we have seen a lot of fintech development around the world, and geographies around the world. They're developing the fintech sector and their jurisdiction, where basically they're supporting the new entrepreneurial development and they're making sandboxes for testing up of these ideas. So, if we talk about economies like Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, and even Bahrain, they have their fintech regulatory bodies which are there, and they are supporting with providing an ecosystem, and they have sandboxes where new entrepreneurs can test their ideas. We do not see any such kind of development of, like we have in the fintech sector. There are a lot of clusters that we have. We have Maharashtra, we have Gujarat, Gift City, then we have Vizag as a fintech valley. But we have not seen any development in the fintech sector in terms of regulatory sandboxes or any kind of environment that is getting created for new entrepreneurs to test their ideas.
So I think within your question lies the answer itself. When you say that there is hardly any development or whatever, I think the first point, we have to understand which is the location within India which can actually be the fintech hub or whatever. I think Maharashtra, Bombay being very clearly is going to be one. Is it going to happen somewhere else? Are we obsessed with it? It actually becomes that, like whenever I talk to a chief minister or anybody, he'll say, I want to do all these set of industries under the sun in my, state. You have to understand there are 4 or 5 good things that you can do within a state and you should focus on it. Everybody seems to get obsessed. And the question is whether my, city or my state has the antecedents, that has the appropriate talent to push it. The second thing, as you said, whether that ecosystem is getting created or not, I think it is still nascent. It is present in Bombay in some ways, and you have to really push it. This is where government will have to push it out. Just making a city or a park is not going to change anything at all, sir, because you do not have the basic talent. It is like you're saying, I'm going to make Chandigarh the IT hub of the country, which is never going to happen. You can still invest a few more $1 billion in that city and you're going to waste that money. It started in 2003. They've not been able to do a shit with it. And the question is going to be that how do we actually get it right? You have to do away with that obsession and just try to understand what can happen within that location. If you don't do it, we're just going to be talking about the same set of things. I hope they are listening to it now. I see more and more people getting more, open to listening to all these realities. Still a long way to go, but it should happen over a period of time.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Yes, please.
Hi. So among the, this question is for Hemal. Among the 8 categories which the index looks at, what are the categories which India has gained most in?
Sure. So one category that India has gained most in is systemic efficiency. What it measures is stakeholder consultation on IP, coordination between different government offices on IP, as well as awareness raising and capacity building programs. So India in the last 12 months, as we all know, has done extremely well in this particular area. And that's where India scores extremely well. The other area that India scores well is under trademarks. So basically, making well-known marks easier to file. There's also copyright. So in disabling infringing content online, as well as expeditious injunctive style relief for infringers. So, sorry, for the actual sort of copyright owners. So these are the areas that India does extremely well. And India also provides a full term for patent term protection. And that's another area that India does really well on.
Okay. We don't...
One more question, if you don't mind. So this question is for Anil. So where did you get the data for the state-wise innovation rankings, or where did you get the state-level patenting activity data from? Because I've worked on Indian patent data and they don't give state-level information.
So the only difference is that my access is a little different from your access. I got it from NITI. That's all. So I got it from NITI. So we have better data. That's sorry for being brutally honest there. And we have been doing this index for the last 3 years with them.
Where?
I answered the question.
Okay. We're really out of time. Just quickly, I think you partly answered it, but Amit is working on an index with Niti Aayog that perhaps during lunchtime you can catch up with him and see what they're doing. It seems very exciting. Just I'll take 30 seconds to quickly summarize. So Hemal talked about the IP index and mentioned about her results concerning India. It's not all doom and gloom. I think we are doing pretty good in several areas, although the path is long and difficult, as you might have figured out by then. And Amit very nicely pointed out what exactly we need to do specifically with respect to education and development of clusters for creating this nice ecosystem. With that, I'll stop and I'll let it take over.
We thank all our panelists and we request Siddharth to give the token of appreciation to our panelists. So thank you, Hemal. And if you can, yeah, Amit, thank you so much. And I'll request Professor Keith to give a token of appreciation to Professor Siddharth for moderating the session. So. We can take a group picture. Professor, please stay.